That afternoon, the wind didn't just move through the fields, it sounded like it was warning him. Jack Miller didn't listen. He was too busy saving another man's farm while his own was dying. By the time he looked back toward his land, the sky had already turned black, and so had his luck. The clouds above the Kansas plains gathered like an army, thick and heavy, turning daylight into dusk. Jack stood by the fence line of his neighbor's field, hammering loose boards back into place while thunder rolled in the distance. He had promised Henry he'd fix it before the storm hit. Promises were sacred to Jack, even the ones that broke him. The first drops came fast, cold, and sharp. Still, he kept going, shoulders hunched against the rain, mud clinging to his boots. His hands worked on instinct, rough palms gripping the wood, the hammer's rhythm steady like a heartbeat. Every strike said the same thing: help, help, help. When Henry finally showed up, drenched and out of breath, he shouted over the rain, "Jack, you didn't have to." Jack just smiled faintly. Yeah, well, someone had to. He didn't wait for thanks. He never did. By the time he turned his truck toward home, the road had become a river of mud. The storm chased him all the way back, lightning cracking open the sky like an accusation. In the distance, his own land stretched wide, rows of young corn swaying violently under the wind, fragile and defenseless. His heart dropped. He parked near the barn and jumped out. The rain was relentless now, hammering the earth, drowning everything it touched. Jack ran across the field trying to cover what he could, shouting at the wind as if it could hear him. His tarp ripped in two, water rushed through the furrows. He dug channels with his shovel to drain it, but the soil turned to soup under his boots. He worked until his muscles screamed, until the rain washed the strength right out of him. When the thunder finally quieted, the world looked like a battlefield. His crops lay flattened, the barn roof had caved in on one side, and the fences, the same kind he had just fixed for others, were now broken on his own land. Jack stood in silence, soaked, shaking. He didn't know what hurt more, the loss or the irony. By the time he walked back to the porch, the sun had set. His mother was waiting in the doorway, her gray hair damp from the humidity, her face carved with worry. She looked at him, at his ruined clothes, the mud streaked up to his knees. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "Jack, you saved everyone's field but your own." He froze. The words hit harder than the rain ever could. He tried to laugh it off, to say something like, "It's just what I do, Ma." But his throat wouldn't move, because deep down, he knew it was true. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cold food she'd left out for him. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. Each tick a reminder of everything he'd lost by being everyone's savior. His father's photograph hung near the door, a proud man in overalls, smiling faintly at the camera. He could almost hear his voice again. A man's worth is measured by what he gives. He had lived by that line his whole life. But sitting there in the dim light, surrounded by silence and failure, Jack began to wonder, what if giving everything meant losing yourself? He didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rain washing away years of work. At dawn, he went out to the field. The air was heavy with the smell of wet soil. The horizon stretched endlessly, gray and indifferent. His boots sank into the mud with every step. What used to be neat rows of corn were now twisted, broken lines, a graveyard of effort. He knelt and touched one of the plants, bent and half buried. It was still alive, barely. So was he. By mid-morning, the neighbors began to arrive. First Henry, then the Millers, then a few others. They came with sympathetic eyes and full hands, coffee, bread, empty words. But soon enough, their voices turned to requests. Could he help mend a roof? Could he lend his tractor? Could he fix a fence? Jack hesitated. He wanted to say no, but guilt spoke louder than reason. Of course, he said yes. He always said yes. By sunset, he had spent the entire day fixing other people's problems. He hadn't even looked at his own broken barn. On the drive home, he passed miles of drenched fields, some still standing, some lost forever. The air smelled like rain and rust. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, the word no burning in his throat like something he'd swallowed but couldn't digest. When he finally reached home, his mother was sleeping in her chair, the TV casting a dull blue glow across the room. He turned it off and stood there in the quiet, watching her breathe. She looked so small, so tired. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the window. His reflection looked older than he remembered. Eyes hollow, shoulders sagging. He didn't see a man anymore. He saw a machine, built to serve. Outside, the storm had moved on, leaving 1,000 stars scattered across the black sky. Jack hadn't looked at them in years. He whispered to himself, almost without realizing it, "What am I doing?" No answer came. Only the faint sound of wind brushing against the house, gentle now, almost forgiving. The next day came and went like all the others. Jack worked, fixed, carried, smiled. People called his name as he drove through town. They waved, they thanked him, they said, "We don't know what we'd do without you, Jack." But not one of them asked how he was doing. By the end of the week, he felt hollowed out. Not angry, not sad, just empty, like a candle that had burned too long. One evening, he found himself driving out past the town, down an old dirt road lined with cottonwoods. At the end of it stood a faded farmhouse, the paint peeling, the porch leaning slightly to the left. Old Ben lived there, the kind of man who had seen enough seasons to stop fighting the ones he couldn't control. Jack hadn't visited in years, but tonight, something pulled him there. When Ben saw him walking up the path, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded and motioned for Jack to sit beside him on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in gold and rust. The world felt slower here, quieter. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jack said, "I lost my field in the storm." Ben nodded slowly. "Heard about that. I was helping Henry. By the time I got back..." He stopped, voice cracking. It was gone. Ben's eyes stayed on the horizon. "And you'd do it again, wouldn't you?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. Ben leaned back, the wood creaking under him. "You remind me of myself a long time ago, always fixing someone else's mess, thinking it made me a better man." He turned to Jack. "But there's something you need to understand." Jack looked up. Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness. It's self-destruction. The words cut through the air like lightning. Jack blinked, confused. "You think helping people is wrong?" Ben shook his head. "No, but when you help everyone except yourself, it's not help anymore. It's a slow kind of suicide." The silence that followed felt heavy. Jack stared at the ground, his mind racing. Ben's voice softened. "You think people love you because you're always there for them? But the truth is, they've learned they don't have to be there for you. You've trained them that way." Jack swallowed hard. The truth stung because it fit too well. If I stop helping, who am I then? Ben smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what you need to find out." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet grass and distant rain. The crickets started their song. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. The world kept turning, indifferent to his confusion. Jack sat there long after Ben went inside. He watched the stars appear one by one. The same stars his father once showed him from the back of a pickup truck. The same stars he hadn't looked at since he became the man who never said no. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel the urge to move, to fix, to please. He just sat there, breathing, thinking, feeling the ache of a life that had belonged to everyone but himself. He didn't know it yet, but something had begun to change. A small fracture in the old pattern, a question that wouldn't stop echoing. What if I stopped saying yes? The wind brushed against his face again, softer now, almost like an answer. And for the first time in a long, long while, Jack Miller didn't rush to do anything about it.
Jack woke the next morning with a heaviness that sat on his chest like wet bricks. The world outside seemed sharper somehow, the sunlight cutting through the haze of exhaustion. For the first time in years, he didn't rush to check on anyone else. He lingered in his kitchen, staring at the untouched coffee cup, feeling its warmth as if it could anchor him. The fields were still a mess, broken fences, bent stalks, muddy rows stretching farther than he could see. Normally, that would have sent him running, toolbox in hand, moving from one neighbor to the next, patching, fixing, saving. But not today. Today, he stayed. He stood at the edge of his property and let the wind hit his face. It carried the smell of damp soil and distant smoke from chimneys, the quiet pulse of life he had long ignored. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own needs pressing against the walls he had built with good intentions. A knock at the gate broke his reverie. It was Henry, carrying a bucket of eggs and a hesitant smile. "Morning, Jack," Henry said, glancing at the bent fence. "Thought I'd—" Jack held up a hand. "I can't, Henry. Not today." Henry froze. His smile faltered. "But your fence, your crops—" "They'll survive," Jack interrupted, his voice firmer than he expected. "I have to take care of my own first." Henry blinked, like Jack had spoken a language he didn't understand. Slowly he nodded, shifting the bucket in his hands. "All right, if you say so." Jack watched him go. The ache of guilt rose like a wave, but beneath it, something else stirred, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of relief. The day stretched long and empty, filled with the kind of quiet that felt dangerous at first. Without the constant pull of other people's needs, Jack was left alone with himself. Memories he had buried under decades of obligation began to surface. The time he missed with his father before he died. The lonely nights after a storm when he had stayed up fixing someone else's roof while his own house leaked. The sacrifices he had made, thinking they were noble. He wandered through his field, touching broken stalks, bending low to lift debris. This was the first time in years he had actually looked at his land instead of just moving through it as a passageway to someone else's problems. He realized, painfully, how much he had neglected himself and how much he had been neglecting the very thing that connected him to life, his own roots, his own soil. By late afternoon, his mother came out to the porch, her eyes soft, knowing. "You're doing it differently," she said. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. "I have to." "You won't be popular for it," she warned. "People will call you selfish." He thought about Henry, about the Millers, about all the neighbors who depended on him. They never needed him the way he needed himself. "Maybe that's the point," he murmured. Over the next few days, Jack practiced saying no, first in small ways, then in slightly larger ones. He refused a neighbor's request to repair a leaky barn. He didn't lend his tractor to move grain. Each refusal sent a pang of guilt through his chest, like a sting he wasn't sure he deserved. At night, he replayed each interaction, wondering if he had failed morally, spiritually, as a man. Yet in the quiet, he discovered something he hadn't felt in years: choice. It was subtle at first, a sense of control returning, a small space in his day that belonged only to him. He walked his fields slowly, listening to the wind and the earth. He noticed details he hadn't seen before, the way the corn leaves glistened with dew, the patterns the mud made after the rain, the distant hawks circling high above. For the first time, he felt like he belonged to this land, not just to the people who walked over it. And yet, the world didn't pause for his self-discovery. Requests kept coming, subtle at first, then insistent. Jack's heart ached with every refusal, but with each no, a small ember of strength ignited inside him. He realized that he didn't need to be everyone's hero to be good, that being good didn't mean sacrificing himself entirely. One evening, after a long day of tending his own fields and mending what he could, he sat on the porch, exhausted but oddly at peace. The sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in gold and purple. He thought of Ben's words, "Kindness without boundaries isn't kindness, it's self-destruction." He let them settle. He had spent decades building a life for everyone else. Now he began constructing one for himself. The first true test came unexpectedly. A violent windstorm rolled in from the west, threatening to flatten his neighbor's barns and fences. Jack could feel the familiar tug in his chest, the urge to drop everything, jump in the truck, save the day. But this time, he didn't. He stayed on his own land, bracing his barn, securing the young crops, covering what he could with tarps and rope. All night, rain and wind tore at his farm, but for the first time, Jack worked for himself. No one called his name, no one demanded his presence. And when morning came, battered though his fields were, they had survived. It was a revelation. The world did not collapse because he refused to rescue it. His life did not unravel because he prioritized his own survival. Jack felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness. There was guilt, yes, but also a seed of hope. He understood now that saving himself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was what allowed him to continue being the man he wanted to be, without disappearing entirely in the service of others. In the following days, Jack found a rhythm between responsibility and self-care. He still helped when he could, but he measured it now. He learned to say no with conviction, without apology. Each refusal became an act of love, love for himself, for the life he had inherited, for the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Neighbors murmured at first, then adjusted. Some were confused, some were irritated. But slowly, they learned that Jack Miller's worth was not measured by how often he dropped everything for them. They began to see him as he was, a man with limits, a man who could finally stand for himself. One evening, after a long day of tending his own fields and mending what he could, his mother came out to the porch and leaned against the railing. She didn't say a word, just looked at him. There was pride in her eyes, tempered by worry, tempered by relief. "You're learning," she said softly. Jack nodded, letting the warmth of the moment fill him. For the first time in years, he felt like a man who had not just survived storms, he had learned from them. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that the path he had begun to walk, the one that demanded courage, discomfort, and self-respect, was only just beginning. The world outside his fence still demanded much from him, but he had discovered a truth he could never forget. Saying no didn't make him less, it made him whole.
The mornings grew quieter, but the tension in the town was anything but silent. Jack had begun to refuse requests, small ones at first, like lending a wheelbarrow or fixing a gate. But word travels fast in a place where everyone knows everyone's business. At first, people were confused. Henry stared at him across the fence one afternoon, arms crossed, brow furrowed. "Jack, I thought you'd come by today." Jack shook his head. "I can't. My fields need me." Henry's shoulders slumped. There was no anger, just disappointment, the kind that weighs heavier than any shout.
By the third refusal, whispers began circulating through the town. "Jack Miller's changed," someone said at the feed store. "He used to be a good man." Jack heard it, and it stung more than he wanted to admit. The approval he had once relied on, the subtle reward of being needed, was evaporating. He felt the tug of old habits, the familiar itch in his chest that begged him to drop everything and save everyone, to be the man they wanted. He resisted. Days passed, and Jack learned that saying no carried consequences beyond guilt. There were social costs, quiet ones that pressed on him like invisible weights. Neighbors would ask, politely, but their eyes betrayed a subtle judgment. Invitations dwindled. Favors he had once been asked to help with were done without him, and in some cases, with a hint of resentment. One afternoon he went into town to buy supplies. The clerk at the feed store, usually talkative, greeted him with a hesitant smile. "Morning, Jack." "Morning," Jack replied. The man hesitated, tapping the counter. "Heard you've been keeping busy. On your own land?" "Notin', yeah." The clerk gave a half shrug. "Folks were just saying, things feel different around here. Not the same without you helping out." Jack forced a polite smile, but the comment hit deeper than he let on. He felt the air grow heavier around him. The town that once felt like family now looked at him like a stranger. That night, Jack ate dinner in silence. His mother sat across from him, watching him stir his food more than eat it. "You don't have to carry their judgment, Jack," she said quietly. "They're just uncomfortable because they were used to your giving." I sighed. "I know, but part of me wonders if I've lost something good. Maybe I've gone too far." Her mother smiled softly. "No, you're just learning the difference between love and approval. They're not the same thing." Her words lingered long after she went to bed. Jack walked outside, the night air cool and heavy with the scent of the fields. He looked up at the stars, bright, indifferent, eternal, and felt small beneath them. He wondered how many years he'd spent chasing the illusion of being needed. It was strange how being useful had become his only proof of worth. He remembered being a boy, following his father through the fields, watching how the man worked tirelessly, never asking for help, never saying no. Maybe he had learned it then that to be good meant to be exhausted, that love meant sacrifice, even if it bled you dry. The realization hit him like a quiet truth he didn't want to face. He hadn't been kind all these years. He had been afraid of being unseen, unloved, unnecessary. The next morning, he tried to shake the feeling by working harder on his own land. The rhythm of labor usually calmed him, the creak of the shovel, the smell of soil, the whisper of wind through the wheat. But that day, the work didn't soothe him. It only mirrored the turmoil in his chest. By noon, sweat dripped from his brow, his shirt clinging to his back. He dropped the shovel and looked toward the horizon where dark clouds were gathering again. Another storm. The radio warned of strong winds and heavy rain, the kind that could undo weeks of work. Jack's chest tightened. He knew what the town would expect, the same man who always came running, the one who fixed, carried, saved. He looked at his phone. The messages had already started. "Jack, could you help cover the barn roof?" "Jack, we can't handle this one alone." "Please, Jack, just this time." He sat in silence for a long while, phone in hand, eyes unfocused. Then, almost mechanically, he turned the phone off and set it aside. He walked to the window and watched the first drops of rain darken the dirt outside. "Not this time," he whispered to himself. He secured his barn doors, covered the equipment, checked on the livestock. He worked with an intensity born not from obligation, but from something new, ownership of his own boundaries. As the storm grew violent, lightning flashing across the fields, Jack stayed focused. The winds howled, but he didn't run. For the first time, he didn't scatter his strength across the needs of others. He stayed rooted. Hours passed before the storm began to ease. The rain softened, the thunder drifted away,
and the first light of dawn crept across the horizon. Jack stepped outside, boots sinking into the wet earth. His fields were battered, but still standing. His barn was intact. The animals were safe. He exhaled a long, trembling breath, relief, disbelief, pride. He looked across the distance toward the neighboring farms. A few roofs were damaged, a few trees down, but smoke already rose from chimneys. People were fixing what was broken. They had survived without him. The world hadn't fallen apart. It was a strange and humbling revelation. Later that day, Jack walked into town. Some greeted him cautiously, others avoided eye contact. I heard a few whispers. "Jack's different now. He thinks he's better than us." He stopped by the general store where the same clerk met him with a measured look. "Heard your place made it through all right." Jack nodded. "It did. Yours?" "Roof took a beating, but we managed." Jack smiled gently. "Good. I knew you would." The man looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, reluctant nod. "Guess we don't fall apart as easy as we think." Jack paid for his supplies and left, the conversation echoing in his head. Maybe the town didn't need a savior. Maybe they just needed time to remember their own strength. That evening, old Ben stopped by. He leaned against the fence, the same way he always did, eyes steady and knowing. "Heard you stayed home during the storm." Jack wiped his hands on his jeans. "I did." Ben grinned faintly. "And?" Jack looked out over his land, muddy but alive. "And? Nothing broke. Not me, not the world." Ben chuckled. "You're starting to get it. You can't save people from every storm. Sometimes they need the rain to remember they can rebuild." Jack nodded slowly. "I think I needed it too." The two men stood in silence for a long while, watching the sun dip behind the clouds. The air smelled of wet grass and second chances. Over the next few weeks, Jack noticed subtle changes. The gossip faded. The neighbors, once resentful, began to mirror his restraint. They asked for advice instead of help, learning to mend fences, fix tractors, plan for storms. The town didn't collapse, it evolved. Jack, too, evolved. His days became quieter, but fuller. He rose before dawn, worked with purpose, and ended each evening on the porch watching the light fade over his land. The ache of loneliness still visited him sometimes, but it was no longer a torment. It was simply space, the space he had earned by finally choosing himself. One night, as fireflies blinked over the fields, Jack thought about the years he had lost to pleasing others. He thought about the storms he had run into, the exhaustion he had mistaken for virtue. And he realized that the peace he now felt had always been waiting, buried beneath the noise of obligation. The road back to himself hadn't been easy. It had cost him comfort, approval, belonging. But as he looked out over the gentle sway of his crops, glowing gold in the moonlight, he knew that he had traded them for something far rarer: freedom. The whispers in town no longer mattered. What mattered was the quiet truth that lived inside him now, a truth he had nearly forgotten. A man's worth isn't measured by how much he gives away, but by how long he guards what's sacred. Jack Miller, the man who had once said yes to everything, had learned the power of saying no. And in that simple act, he had begun to reclaim the life he had almost lost.
The summer came heavy that year. The air felt thick, swollen with the kind of stillness that precedes something catastrophic. Even the birds seemed to know. They flew low, their wings cutting the heat with quiet urgency. Jack woke before sunrise, as he always did, but the silence in the air wasn't the ordinary calm of morning. It was the pause before a scream. He stepped outside. The sky was bruised purple on the horizon, and the wind carried a strange tension, restless, sharp, the kind that makes your instincts whisper before your mind understands why. He checked his phone. Tornado warning?
Category 5. Winds capable of tearing the earth from its roots. Jack's pulse quickened. The memory of the last storm flashed through him. The rain, the panic, the endless calls for help. He'd survived that one by holding his ground. But this was different. He felt his chest tighten. As he began securing the barn doors, his phone buzzed again. A name appeared on the screen. Henry. Jack froze. He hadn't heard from Henry since the tension began months ago. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. The phone buzzed again, then again. He answered. "Jack!" Henry's voice was frantic, broken by static. "It's coming straight for us. The roof's half gone. I can't. My wife?" The call cut off. For a long second, Jack just stood there, the phone trembling in his hand. The rational part of him whispered, "You can't help them. You barely survived last time." But the other voice, the one buried deep, older than reason, rose like thunder. The voice that had always said, "You fix things, Jack. You save people." He clenched his jaw. For the first time in months, the two halves of himself went to war. He looked toward the north fields, where Henry's farm stood just beyond the ridge. The wind had begun to twist, a low, growing roar building in the distance. The tornado hadn't touched down yet, but it would, soon. He ran to his truck, engine rumbling to life. His heart hammered against his ribs. But as he gripped the steering wheel, another sound broke through the wind. His mother's voice in his memory. "You can't save people from every storm. Sometimes they need the rain to remember they can rebuild." His hands trembled. He shut his eyes. Then, slowly, he turned off the ignition. The sound of the engine died. The silence was deafening. Jack stepped out and looked toward the horizon. A black funnel forming, spinning faster, growing stronger. He could feel its pull, like a living thing demanding his surrender. He wanted to run. Every muscle screamed for action, for the old instinct of rescue. But he didn't move. Instead, he ran back inside the barn. He untied the animals, led them to the shelter, covered the windows, bolted the doors. His movements were sharp, precise, not frantic, but deliberate. Every decision carried the weight of choice. Outside, the sky split open. The roar grew monstrous. The ground trembled beneath his boots. The air turned electric, the smell of metal and earth colliding. Jack crouched inside the shelter, gripping the door handle as if holding the line between chaos and survival. The sound was indescribable. Not thunder, not wind, but the voice of the world being torn apart. He could hear things breaking outside, trees snapping, boards ripping free, the wind howling like a beast unleashed. And through it all, one thought tore at his chest. Henry. He almost stood. Almost. But then, amidst the madness, something shifted. The roar was no longer just outside. It was inside. Him. The storm he had carried his whole life. The need to fix, to save, to be indispensable. The voice that had stolen his peace for years. He realized this was never about storms or neighbors. It was about control, about believing the world would fall apart if he didn't hold it together. Tears burned his eyes as he whispered, barely audible over the wind, "It's not my job to save the world." And with that, something inside him broke. or perhaps finally healed. The tornado roared past. Minutes felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it came, the sound began to fade. The pressure in the air lifted. Silence returned. Thick, unreal. Jack waited a moment before opening the shelter door. The light outside was strange, golden and gray all at once. The world was broken, but alive. Branches scattered, roof shingles torn away. One of the barns had collapsed, but his house stood. His animals were safe. He stepped into the open, mud clinging to his boots. His hands trembled, not from fear this time, but release. He looked toward the ridge. Smoke rose faintly from where Henry's place stood. His heart twisted, fear, guilt, hope, all tangled together. He started walking. The road was blocked with debris, but Jack climbed over it, step by step. When he reached the clearing, he saw Henry's barn half gone, but his truck was there, and through the shattered door came voices, coughing, shouting, alive. Henry stumbled out, clothes torn, face streaked with dirt. When he saw Jack, his eyes widened, part shock, part disbelief. "Jack? You didn't come," he said, voice cracking. Jack lowered his head. "No, I didn't." Henry looked at him for a long moment, then exhaled a shaky breath. "We made it. Barely, but we made it." Jack nodded. "I know." The two men stood there in the wreckage of everything they'd built, and for the first time, Jack didn't feel the urge to apologize. Henry's eyes softened. "Guess you were right to stay. I had to figure it out myself." Jack looked out at the ruined fields, the scattered pieces of their lives, and felt something strange. Pride, not for surviving the storm, but for finally letting go of the illusion that he was the only one who could. That night, as the stars emerged through the fading clouds, Jack sat on his porch, a lantern flickering beside him. The world around him was scarred, but quiet, like a wound finally beginning to heal. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing approval, mistaking exhaustion for virtue. He had believed love was earned through sacrifice, that worth came from usefulness. But storms have a way of teaching truths no calm day ever could. In losing his old self, he had found something deeper, the quiet strength of presence, not performance. He no longer needed to be everyone's hero. He just needed to be whole. The wind had stopped. The night was still. And for the first time in his life, Jack Miller didn't feel empty. He felt free.
The first signs of autumn crept across the Kansas plains. The fields glimmered with golden wheat, the late sun casting long shadows over Jack's farm. The air carried a crispness that hinted at change, not just in the weather, but in everything that had been weighed down by the long summer storms. Jack walked among the rows of corn, hands brushing the stalks with careful familiarity. Every plant told a story, some scarred, some thriving, and he had tended to each one not as a duty, but as an act of reverence for life itself. Months had passed since the great tornado. Since that night, Jack had found a rhythm he hadn't known in decades. The need to save everyone had dimmed, replaced by a steadier, quieter focus on what he could control: his own land, his own health, his own heart. He paused at the edge of the field, looking toward the small town in the distance, The memory of the whispers, the judgment, the suspicion, it all lingered like faint smoke from a fire long extinguished, but it no longer had the power to shape him. A soft voice broke through the wind. "Jack!" He turned and saw old Ben walking toward him, leaning slightly on his cane. Even after all these months, Ben moved with a deliberate pace, each step measured, as though the weight of a lifetime guided him forward. Jack smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. "Ben? Didn't expect to see you today." Ben chuckled, the sound carrying over the fields. "Didn't expect to come either, but thought it was time." He stopped beside Jack, his gaze sweeping across the thriving crops. "Looks like you survived the storms, inside and out." Jack nodded. "I did. It wasn't easy. Some days I thought I'd lose myself completely, but I found something." Ben leaned on his cane, studying him. "And what's that?" "Peace. A quiet kind of peace. Not from doing everything for everyone, but from knowing I don't have to." Ben's eyes twinkled. "That's a rare thing, Jack. Most men chase approval until there's nothing left of them. You found your ground before it was too late." They walked together toward the farmhouse, boots sinking into the damp soil. The conversation drifted to ordinary things, the new fences, the state of the barns, the crops that had survived the tornado. But Jack noticed something new in himself. He could speak without urgency, without the gnawing anxiety that had haunted him for years. As they approached the porch, a familiar figure appeared at the gate, Henry. His clothes were clean, his hands free of dirt, but his expression held the weariness of someone who had learned lessons the hard way. "Henry, Jack," he said, voice cautious, almost reverent. "Mind if I come by?" Jack stepped aside, opening the gate. "Of course." Henry walked slowly, taking in the transformation around him, the thriving fields, the repaired barns, the quiet strength in Jack's posture. He paused before speaking again. I wanted to thank you, not for helping us that night," he gestured vaguely toward the horizon, "but for not coming, for letting us face the storm ourselves. I didn't realize we could." Jack looked at him, understanding settling in. "You had to learn it on your own. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we think we can't survive." Henry nodded, relief washing over his features. "I get it now. I see why you changed, and I respect that." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the scent of wet earth and ripening crops. There was no need for more words. The acknowledgement itself was heavy with unspoken understanding, a bond forged not by dependency, but by mutual recognition of strength and boundaries. Inside the farmhouse, Jack's mother prepared tea, her hands steady, her presence a soft anchor. She had watched her son navigate the storms, literal and figurative, and now she observed him flourish in ways that were quietly extraordinary. "Looks like the boy finally learned to take care of himself," she said, smiling, her voice warm and tender. Jack poured the tea, handing a cup to Ben and one to himself. "It took a long time. I almost forgot what it meant to live for me instead of for everyone else." His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "And yet you've never stopped being kind. You've just chosen where it matters most. That's what makes you stronger, not weaker." Ben sipped his tea thoughtfully. "You've built something here, Jack. Not just crops and barns, but a life that isn't owned by other people's expectations." Jack nodded, letting the words sink in. The sound of the wind outside seemed softer, the fields breathing with a calm of their own. He had weathered storms that had tested every fiber of his being, and now he felt the gravity of his own strength for the first time. Later that afternoon, Henry lingered at the edge of the porch. "I know I can't undo what I've said or thought when you were different, but I want to help now, if you'll let me." Jack looked at him, considering the offer. It wasn't about pride, nor about the approval that he once craved. It was about connection, mutual support, and respect for limits, the new rules he had learned to live by. "I'd like that," he said. "We can rebuild together, on our own terms." Henry's face relaxed into a tentative smile. It was fragile, yet real, a bridge forming across months of misunderstanding, doubt, and unspoken tension. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows over the land, Jack walked to the edge of the field. He watched the horizon, wide, infinite, and now unbroken by panic or expectation. The memory of storms past lingered, but it no longer held him captive. Each scar on the land was a reminder not of failure, but of survival, resilience, and choice. Jack took a deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air fill his lungs. For the first time in decades, he felt fully present, grounded not in service to everyone else, but in the quiet honor of being whole. Old Ben stood beside him, leaning lightly on his cane. "You've done well, Jack. Better than most men manage in a lifetime." Jack allowed himself a rare, full smile. "It feels different now, lighter, like I can finally breathe without worrying about everything else." Ben chuckled softly. "That's life, son. That's what it's supposed to feel like." Jack's mother came to stand behind him, resting her hands lightly on his shoulder. "You've made choices that scared you, and yet you're here. You found yourself even in the storm." Jack closed his eyes for a moment. The warmth of her hands, the steady presence of Ben, and the cautious hope in Henry's gaze, it all combined into something he had never allowed himself to feel fully: belonging without surrender. As the night settled over the Kansas plains, lanterns flickering across the porch, Jack reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of every storm he had faced, the calls for help he had once answered without question, the nights of exhaustion, the whispers of disapproval, and the heavy burden of endless giving. And he realized something profound. True generosity does not come from sacrifice alone. It comes from understanding limits, from respecting oneself, and from sharing strength without losing it. Henry finally left, promising to return the next morning to help with repairs. Jack watched him walk away, and for the first time, he didn't feel the old pull of obligation. He simply felt connection, mutual, and chosen. The stars came out over the plains, each one flickering against the dark velvet sky. The wind whispered softly through the wheat, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth and new beginnings. Jack Miller, the man who once said yes to everything, had learned that saying no was not failure. It was the path to something deeper. Respect, love, and life fully reclaimed. He sat on the porch with Ben and his mother, sipping tea in the quiet evening, and finally allowed himself to simply be. No pretense, no exhaustion, no guilt. In that stillness, Jack understood something eternal. Storms will come, and winds will howl. But when a man knows where to stand, when he honors himself as much as he honors others, he can survive anything and live beyond it. And in that moment, with the stars above and the fields around him, Jack smiled. Not because he had saved everyone, not because he had proved anything, but because he had finally saved himself. The night settled over the Kansas plains, soft and complete, carrying with it the quiet truth Jack had discovered. A life chosen with care, courage, and love for oneself is the life most worth living. And the farm, the town, the people, all were witnesses, in their own way, to a man reborn. Jack Miller, at last, was home.